On the morning of her wedding, her fiancé walked into the room. He looked at her in the wheelchair. He looked at the wedding dress. And he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to make clear what he actually thought of her. "You look beautiful," he said. "Should we get started?" And Novalee Crest Wren looked at the man she had trusted with her savings, her body, and 2 years of her life, and she said 4 words. "You already left." He did not understand what that meant yet. He was about to. If you have ever trusted someone who was studying you instead of loving you, this story is for you. Corinthia Vance placed a single page on the table between them. Page 39 of the prenuptial agreement. 2 highlighted paragraphs. Garrison's smile left his face. He had spent 18 months engineering the perfect trap. He had not read every page. She had. Garrison Thule Beckett was 42 years old and had spent his entire adult life chasing the wealth his family lost when he was in his early 20s. His father's construction company collapsed. Bad debt, bad decisions, the whole structure gone in under a year. The money never came back. Garrison spent 2 decades running toward wealth he felt the world owed him, and across those 2 decades he developed a pattern with women that was less about love and more about what they had that he needed. He met Novalee at a Civic Architecture Awards ceremony in Portland. He was there with a client. She was there receiving a commendation for a library she had designed in East Portland. He introduced himself after the ceremony. He asked questions. He listened. He remembered. He was attentive in the practiced way of a man who understood that attention was a currency, and had become very good at spending it where it would return the most. There was one early moment. At a dinner 3 weeks in, she mentioned her doctors. The window closing on a surgery she had been saving for. He nodded but asked nothing. He changed the subject smoothly, the move of someone filing information away and not wanting the other person to know it had been filed. She did not think anything of it then. She thought about it later. There was another moment. 6 months in, when she turned down a project that would have required travel. She explained briefly, without complaint, that the bad weeks were getting longer. He told her that must be difficult. Then, 2 beats later, asked what the firm was worth right now, did she think? She told herself it was an awkward question from someone still learning her world. From the first conversation he had been calculating exactly what she was worth. Novalee Crest Wren was 38 years old. Founder of Wren and Ground Studio. Small firm. Serious work, civic architecture, community centers, public libraries built from the belief that what a city builds for its people says something about what it believes those people deserve. She had a specialty she never advertised. Accessible design. Buildings where a wheelchair moves through every room with the same ease as everyone else. Not as an afterthought. As the first decision. From the first sketch. As the baseline condition of the work. Not a feature added later to meet code requirements, but the premise from which every other decision followed. She had been designing that way since she was 19 years old, because she had been living with osteonecrosis since she was 19 years old. Bone tissue dying from the inside, blood supply cut off, the bone collapsing inward over years, silently on a schedule that answered to nothing. She had made peace with most of it. What she had not made peace with was the window. The surgical option that could halt the progression in her left leg had a closing date. Her doctors had been clear for 3 years. After the window amputation, that was what remained. She had been saving for the surgery since she was 26. 12 years. Every financial decision organized around one number. $94,000. The amount she transferred to Garrison Beckett on a Tuesday morning because he was about to be her husband and she trusted him. Garrison had watched her walk on bad days. He had listened to the doctor calls. He had done the math. They dated for 2 years. He was consistent. He showed up. He remembered small things. A coffee order. A deadline she was stressed about. Her mother's birthday. He made her feel seen, which is how people feel when someone is paying very close attention to them. She did not understand until much later that attention and love are not the same thing. He proposed on a Thursday evening in March. Rehearsed speech. A ring that was slightly too large for her finger. Novalee said yes. 6 months before the wedding, Garrison lost his job. Told her 3 weeks later. Framed it as liberation. He had been wanting to go independent for years. Now was the time. He had a property deal that could set them up for life. He needed capital. He needed $94,000. Novalee transferred it on a Tuesday morning. Because he was about to be her husband. Because she trusted him. Because that was what trust meant. She did not know that $18,000 of that money went directly to an attorney named Clifton Bray. She did not know what Clifton Bray was being paid to build. The prenuptial agreement arrived 4 months before the wedding. Garrison presented it as standard. Protective. His attorney had drafted it. 41 pages. On page 37, buried inside a section titled Joint Asset Management Provisions, was the clause. In the event of permanent physical incapacitation, defined as the inability to independently manage professional or financial affairs due to a documented medical condition, full fiduciary control and beneficial ownership of all jointly acquired assets would transfer to the non-incapacitated spouse. Read that again. He had watched her walk on bad days. He had listened to her doctor calls. He knew the window had closed. He knew what was coming. And he had built a legal mechanism, paid for with her own surgery savings, to take everything from her the moment it arrived. He called it protective. He believed he was being patient. What he did not know was that Novalee had her own attorney, Corinthia Vance, 51 years old, family law specialist, one of the most respected attorneys in Portland. Novalee had hired her quietly, 2 weeks after Garrison first mentioned the prenup. Something in how he said the word protective had not sat right. A prepared quality to the explanation. Pause in the wrong place. Corinthia read all 41 pages. She found the clause on page 37 in 40 minutes. She called Novalee, 3 words before anything else. Do not sign. The shape of it, once Corinthia explained it, was this. Garrison had identified Novalee's medical condition as a financial vulnerability. He had built a mechanism to convert that vulnerability into control. He had paid for that mechanism with her own money, and handed it to her and called it love. Novalee sat with the phone in her hand after Corinthia finished. She sat with it for 3 days. She thought about the $94,000 in his account. She thought about 2 years of performances she had read as love. She thought about the ring that was slightly too large, the speech that was slightly too rehearsed, the dinner where she mentioned the surgery window and he filed it away and changed the subject without asking a single question. The conversation about the firm's worth dropped in 2 beats after pretending to be sympathetic. All of it had been there. She had chosen to call it love. She had been wrong. She did not call him in those 3 days. She did not confront him. She gave nothing away. She sat with the full picture and looked at it clearly and let it be exactly what it was. She was not angry. She was precise. There is a difference between those 2 things, and Novalee understood that difference better than most people do. She had spent 19 years managing a body that required precision over panic, decisions made from clarity rather than feeling, the discipline of moving through pain without advertising it. She had been trained for exactly what this required. On the 3rd day, she called Corinthia back. I want to sign it, she said. With one addition. Corinthia drafted the counter clause on a Wednesday afternoon. 2 paragraphs. Any asset transfer triggered by the incapacitation provision would be rendered null and void if the non-incapacitated spouse voluntarily abandoned the marriage within the first 12 calendar months. Abandonment defined as physical departure without mutual written consent. Clifton Bray reviewed the final document on behalf of Garrison. He missed it. Page 39. Right after the clause he had drafted. Formatted to look like a natural continuation. He was looking for his own work and assumed everything surrounding it was standard. Garrison signed on a Wednesday. He did not read past page 37. Corinthia filed her copy. She wrote 3 words in the margin beside the counter clause. She read everything. The surgery was on a Tuesday in January, 11 days before the wedding. She had not told Garrison. She had tried. Every time she reached for the moment, she remembered how he talked about dependency, about people who needed things, about weakness. She heard those conversations and she understood, beneath the love she was working to hold on to, exactly what he would do. So she called Soren, Garrison's younger brother, the person who did not announce himself before he showed up. He simply showed up. He drove 3 hours from Eugene. He was in the waiting room when she came out of recovery. He had coffee he did not drink and a book he did not read, and he stayed until she told him she was all right. She told him she was all right. He looked at her for a moment, the look of a person who does not fully believe you but understands you need them to let you have it. He let her have it. He stayed another hour. Then he left and texted from the highway that he would be back Thursday. She said she was fine. He came back Thursday. Garrison arrived at the hospital 4 hours after the surgery. For hours. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway and looked at her in the bed, and then his eyes moved to the space under the blanket where her left leg ended below the knee. He stood very still. His face did something she had not seen before. Not grief, not shock. Something colder than either. The face of a man running a calculation and not liking what it returned. A reassessment. That was what it was. She had seen that face before. She recognized it now, the same face from the dinner when she mentioned the surgery window, the same face from the question about the firm's worth. The face of a man looking at an asset and updating its value. She watched him from the bed and understood, clearly, finally, without any remaining question, that she had never been loved in this relationship. She had been an asset, and the asset had just been written down. He said he needed time to process. He turned. He left. The door closed. Not a slam. Just the soft mechanical seal of a hospital door finding its frame. The room was quiet. The 4-line clicked. Somewhere down the corridor a call button chimed and went unanswered. The air recycled through the vents with a faint steady hiss that had probably been running since she woke up from surgery, but she was only hearing it now. She lay there. She did not cry. She had been carrying something for 2 years. A small persistent doubt she had been choosing to read as her own anxiety rather than what it actually was. And now it had a shape. A name. A door that had just closed without him coming to the bedside first. She had lost her leg. She had lost 12 years of savings. She had lost the 2 years she spent trusting someone who had been running numbers on her from the first conversation. And in the silence of that room, what arrived was not collapse. It was clarity. Cold, complete, useful clarity. That night Soren called. He did not mention Garrison. He did not ask what had happened or why no one was there. He just talked about nothing, about a road closure on the drive back to Eugene, about a ridiculous conversation he had overheard at a gas station, about absolutely nothing of consequence, for 45 minutes until she fell asleep on the phone. She found out later he had been sitting in the hospital parking lot the entire time. He had not gone home. He had moved his car to the parking lot and stayed. The morning of the wedding Garrison arrived at the venue. Not to marry her. His attorney delivered a letter. He was exercising his right under the incapacitation clause. Fiduciary control of all jointly held assets. Effective immediately, pending the ceremony. He had come in his wedding suit. He believed the marriage had to happen first for the clause to activate. He had come to go through with it. What his attorney had not told him, because his attorney had not read page 39, was that the counter clause was already written. That it had been waiting since the day Garrison signed. Novalee was in her wedding dress when Corinthia handed her the letter. She read it standing up. "Let him in," she said. Garrison walked in. He looked at the wheelchair, the wedding dress, Corinthia beside her with a folder. He smiled. The smile of a man who believes he is the only person in the room who knows what is actually happening. "You look beautiful," he said. "Should we get started?" Novalee looked at him. "You already left," she said. Garrison's smile held. Corinthia placed page 39 on the table between them. 1 page, 2 paragraphs. Garrison looked at his attorney, who stepped into the hallway with the document. The door closed behind him. Garrison stood in the room. He did not speak. Novalee did not speak. Corinthia did not move. 2 minutes, maybe 3. The attorney came back inside. He looked at Garrison. Not at Novalee. Garrison. 2 words. "It's valid." Garrison stood in that room and understood, for the first time, that he had not been the only one reading. He stood very still. The folder sat on the table between them, exactly where Corinthia had placed it. Page 39 face up on the table. He had triggered the abandonment clause himself. The afternoon he stood in the doorway of the recovery room, ran his calculation, and chose to leave. He had walked into his own trap. With his own legs. He left without a word. Soren was standing in the hallway. He watched his brother walk past without looking at him. Then he walked into the room and sat down beside Novalee. He did not say anything. She did not ask him to. The year that followed was not gentle. Litigation, rehabilitation, the grief of realizing how long something had been wrong before you had language for what wrong felt like. She kept the firm. She hired a third architect, a young woman named Delia who brought energy and asked no questions about why the firm's principal sometimes arrived at 9 in the morning, looking like she had been awake since 4. Delia probably understood. She did not say so. That was exactly what Novalee needed in a colleague that year, and she did not take it for granted. She showed up every day. Soren moved to Portland 4 months later. He did not announce it. He called one Tuesday, said he would be in the city for a while, and appeared Thursday. He started helping with whatever needed doing, driving her to physical therapy appointments she would have taken alone without complaint, picking up the logistical edges of running a small firm, making dinner on the nights she forgot that food existed. He found a job with an engineering firm on the east side. He did not perform this. He did not require gratitude for it. He did not once say, "I gave up something to be here." There were nights in that first year when Novalee sat at her drafting table at 11 o'clock and thought about the two brothers. The same house, the same parents, the same starting point. One had learned that warmth was a strategy. The other had never stopped being warm. She never said this to Soren. He would have deflected it, changed the subject, asked how the drawings were coming along and handed her something to eat. That was how he received gratitude. By pretending the conversation was about something else. Wren and Ground Studio survived the year. Then it grew. 3 years after the wedding morning, Novalee received a letter from the Oregon Historic Preservation Office. The East Portland Community Library, the building she had designed 8 years earlier, the commendation she was receiving the night she met Garrison, the building he had dismissed as small work during an argument she had not fully understood at the time, had been nominated for a National Civic Architecture Preservation Award. Petra found her 2 weeks later, an investigative journalist at Oregon Public Press. She had been covering civic architecture and urban development for 11 years. She had spent a week reading everything she could find about Novalee Crest Wren, the firm, the buildings, the accessible design work, the awards, and then spent 3 days cross-referencing the name Garrison Beckett against public court records, federal fraud filings, and bankruptcy proceedings before she made the call. She called. She explained exactly what the piece would cover and did not soften any of it. The architecture, the commendation, the firm, the prenuptial agreement, the surgery, the hospital, the wedding morning, the counter clause, the fraud, the sentencing, all of it in the order it happened. Novalee listened to the full description without interrupting. Then she said she needed to think about it. Soren told her to do it. His reasoning was simple. The story was true, Petra had done the work to earn it, and some things deserve to be public even when public is harder than private. He said it without pressure, stating it as a fact he had already thought through and was offering for her consideration, not her compliance. She called Petra back. "Yes," she said. The interviews ran across 3 sessions over 2 weeks. Petra wrote with the restraint of someone who understood that the facts, laid out in sequence, required nothing added. The piece ran on a Sunday. By Tuesday, it had been read by 400,000 people. Most of them were people who had, at some point in their lives, trusted someone who was calculating them instead of loving them. They recognized what they were reading. Aldous Fairweather read it Sunday morning. 57 years old. The founding partner of Fairweather Infrastructure Group. Civic Development. Oregon. 30 years in the business of building things for public use, schools, transit facilities, community centers, the infrastructure that a city's residents interact with every day without thinking about who designed it or why. He had a project sitting in his portfolio for 3 years like an unanswered question. The land belonged to a private development deal that had collapsed under federal investigation. The developer had been convicted of running a fraudulent investment scheme, pooling capital from multiple sources, promising returns that did not exist, sustaining the scheme across 4 years and 17 victims before the forensic trail caught up with him. His assets had been seized. The land had been transferred to a community development trust with a mandate to use it for public benefit. Aldous had seen the developer's name in court documents 18 months earlier. He had made a note. The land's location was excellent. The circumstances suggested it would eventually come available for the right project. He had been patient. That was how he worked. He read Petra's piece on Sunday morning, put it down, and picked it up again from the beginning. By the time he finished the second read, he understood something. The developer's name in those court documents. Garrison Thule Beckett. The same name in Petra's piece. The land his fraud scheme had been designed to develop was going to become a community center. Designed by the woman he had laughed at. Aldous had been in civic development for 30 years. He had seen coincidences. He had never seen one shaped like this. A story that had completed itself before anyone had planned for it to be complete. He had Corinthia Vance's contact information by Monday afternoon. He asked how to reach Novalee Wren. He offered her the commission on a Thursday. A fully accessible community center. The largest civic project in Portland in a decade. Built on the land Garrison's scheme had been designed to develop. The building he had told her would never matter. Novalee accepted before he finished the sentence. When Sandrine, Corinthia's colleague, began due diligence on the project, she pulled the full history of the land. Property transfers, wire records, account histories. She found a wire transfer from 2 years before the wedding. $76,000. From Garrison's account. 14 days after Novalee transferred her surgery savings to him. There was a long silence at first. How much can be recovered? Corinthia told her. Another silence. Okay, Novalee said. Just that and nothing else. The word of a woman who has learned that falling apart is a luxury she has never been able to afford. The charges were filed. Wire fraud. Investment fraud. 17 victims. 4 years documented. The forensic accountant's report was 53 pages long. Numbers do not perform. They just sit in columns and tell the truth that people worked very hard to bury. He was sentenced on a Friday in March. 3 years. Federal prison. Everything stripped. Novalee was not in the courtroom. She was in her studio working on the community center drawings. Soren texted when the verdict came through. She read it, put her phone face down on the drafting table, and kept working. The groundbreaking was the following Monday. Portland. The land Garrison scheme had been designed to develop. A 1/4 acre of cleared ground in a neighborhood that had been promised something on this site for 3 years and had received nothing but a construction hoarding and a developer's name in a federal indictment. Overcast morning. That particular Portland gray. The city paying attention without interrupting. Aldous' team. A handful of city council members who had followed the land's legal history closely enough to want to be present for this. Petra Halloway with a photographer standing at a respectful distance. Present but back, understanding that their presence was secondary to what they were witnessing. Novalee arrived with Soren. Work clothes. No dress. Not anything that said occasion. This was a design day, the first real one of a project that had been living in her mind for months, and she had dressed for the work, not the ceremony. Aldous handed her the shovel. She took it with both hands. She looked at the land for a moment. She thought about the parents with strollers. The elderly residents who had spent their whole lives negotiating steps and would not have to negotiate them here. The person in a wheelchair who would move through every entrance and every corridor of this building with the same ease as everyone else, because the architect had made that the first decision, not the last. Not an accommodation. Not a compliance requirement. The premise. She thought about the 19-year-old who had first understood what it meant to arrive somewhere and find it was not built for her. She pushed the shovel into the ground. Soren stood beside her. No speech. Hands in his coat pockets. He did not look at the photographer. He did not look at Aldous or Petra or the council members. He watched Novalee break ground on the building, and his face held the expression it had held in the hospital waiting room and in the parking lot, and on Thursday he appeared after saying he would be in the city for a while. Present, certain. Not performing anything. He was in the photograph. He did not know he was in it until Petra sent it. He looked at it for a moment and then put his phone down and did not mention it. That was Soren. The building carries her name. No steps. Every entrance level with the street. Every corridor wide enough for 2 wheelchairs side by side. Designed by the woman Garrison Beckett told would never matter. The building that put him in federal prison. The building she broke ground on the Monday of the week he was sentenced. Corinthia kept her copy of page 39. Filed it in a folder she labeled Wren. Oregon family law had never seen an abandonment clause of this precise construction successfully litigated. The ruling in Novalee's case, first of its kind in the state, set a precedent that attorneys now cite when drafting and reviewing prenuptial agreements. It is studied in family law programs. It is referenced in legal journals. It reaches the communities of women who have been handed documents by people they trusted and told. This is standard, this is protective, this is for both of us. Corinthia gets asked to speak about it in workshops sometimes. She always tells the same story. The 41-page document. The clause buried in joint asset management provisions on page 37. The counter clause on page 39 that Clifton Bray never found. The man who signed on a Wednesday afternoon having read 37 pages and stopped. The woman who read every last word and then sat with what she found for 3 days before she decided what to do. Corinthia does not dramatize it. She does not need to. She just describes it exactly as it happened. And every time she tells it, every single time, someone in the room goes quiet. Not from surprise. From recognition. The ruling carries Novalee's name. His name appears in it as the party who lost. That is how the legal record reads. That is how it will always read. He built the trap. She read everything. He triggered it himself. She did not win because she was exceptional. She won because she read the document. She hired an attorney before she needed one. She sat with what she found for 3 days. She did not run. She did not confront him. She did not give herself away. She signed with 2 paragraphs on page 39 that Clifton Bray never found and Garrison never read. And then she waited. She did not engineer Garrison's arrest. She did not arrange for his fraud to unravel on the exact land he had been supposed to develop. She did not plan any of what followed. She did not need to. She stayed precise. And the rest arranged itself around her precision. He spent 18 months building a mechanism to take everything from her. He paid for it with her own money. He handed it to her and called it protection. And then he stood in the doorway of a hospital room, looked at the woman he had been calculating for 2 years, decided the numbers no longer worked, and left. That was the trap closing. He did not need anyone to close it. He walked into it himself, with his own legs, with his own choice. That is the story. A woman in a wheelchair in a wedding dress. A man who laughed. And 2 paragraphs on page 39 that changed everything. Not because they were exceptional, but because she read every page before she made her decision and he did not. Some people say she should have left the moment Corinthia found page 37. That no relationship is worth reading the rest. That she should have taken the $94,000 back and been done with him before the wedding ever happened. Others say what she did was something else entirely. That she turned his weapon into her protection. That she let him destroy himself with exactly the thing he built to destroy her. That there is a kind of strength in finishing the document before you decide what to do with it. Be honest. Have you ever realized someone was not loving you? They were calculating you? Drop a comment. Tell me what you see. And then there is Soren, who drove 3 hours when she called. Who moved to a city without being asked. Who stood beside her at the groundbreaking without needing to be in the photograph. And ended up in it anyway. He did not know he was in it until Petra sent it. He looked at it, put his phone down, and did not mention it. If the story made you think of someone who stayed, send it to them tonight. Subscribe to Storytelling Empire now. New stories with inspiring lessons every week. See you in the next one.